It was a normal day for William Bonin, inmate at the San Quentin State Prison, infamous for his serial murders in California. But there was something else going on this day that had Bonin so excited, actually almost giddy with excitement. This was a day that he had been waiting on for a long time, to meet one of his heroes, a killer he had admired and looked up to, a serial killer, just like himself, who stalked and murdered his victims and discarded their bodies along roadsides and California freeways. So much so that there was an overlap in killings that some investigators believed belonged to Bonin, when in fact, some belonged to Patrick Carney, the trash bag killer, and some belonged to the new inmate coming to join him on death row for the presumed murders of 67 young men. Presumed because they hadn't been all proven, but even the 16 counts of murder placed against Bonin's hero still far exceeded his murder count. The prison sparked with anticipation as the new prisoners arrived, and as one of the new prisoners entered the facility, Bonin was surprised. In walked a light-framed, thin figure, hardly recognizable as a killer of 67. But Bonin knew something inside the serial killer was the true monster that outmatched his own evil, outmatched his wit and ability. The new inmate to walk through the gate was none other than Randy Kraft, the scorecard killer. And even though his name preceded him, his murders were in fact mixed up with Bonin's, so much so to the point that they once dubbed Kraft as the Freeway Strangler. But it wasn't to undo the name of William Bonin, more notably known as the Freeway Killer. Welcome to Murder Wall. My name is Daniel Hart, and I'm your host and your true crime storyteller. Every week we'll take a deep dive into some of the true crime stories surrounding some of the most notorious and unknown murderers and murder cases around the world. We cover the story of a card-playing club known as the San Quentin Bridge Club, where 4 infamous serial killers would get together daily to play bridge. That club was made up of William Bonin, the Freeway Killer, Doug Clark, the Sunset Strip Killer, Lawrence Pliers Bittaker, one of the Toolbox Killers, and Randy Kraft, the Scorecard Killer. Over the next few weeks, we'll dive into each serial killer story that belonged to the club, and this week, we'll take a deeper dive into the story surrounding one of the serial killers in that group, who earned his alias for the area where he left his victims' bodies. His name was William Bonin, or better known as the Freeway Killer. Listener warning, some of the scenes shared in this podcast are violent and graphic in nature and aren't suitable for all listening audiences. Mature listening audiences advised. Let's get into the story. Investigators were alarmed when they began to dig deeper into the serial murders that took place between 1972 and 1980. The death count was around 44 young men killed, and through their investigation, they knew that most of the killings were somehow linked. These murders began to take center stage and became known as the Freeway Killings, and tied to them was a freeway killer. And there were at least 11 of the murder victims that were known homosexuals, pointing to a higher chance that the serial killer at large was in fact, and most probable, homosexual themselves, or had an extreme hate towards gay individuals. Strangulation seemed to be the favored method used by the killer, while others had been stabbed with knives and ice picks, often leaving traces of tortured bodies behind as evidence. They began to see common threads between the murders and agreed in the connection between at least 21 of the 44 murders. By 1983, 16 other murders would be solved with the arrest of the scorecard killer, Randy Kraft. But it was a later connection that 3 serial killers were at work in the area at the same time. Randy Kraft, Patrick Carney, the trash bag killer, and Robert Bonin, who ultimately claimed the final title as the Freeway Killer. May 28, 1979, young 14-year-old Thomas Lundgren was reported to be abducted and found the following day in Malibu, dead. There wasn't anything that grabbed the headlines and say that this was anything out of the ordinary, that it was related to any serial killings, and that a serial killer was on the prowl. But 3 months later, another murder occurred around Cajun Pass, where investigators were investigating a scene where victim Mark Shelton's body was discovered. He had been reported as missing a week earlier on August 4th in Westminster. But what sounded the alarms of authorities was the case of 17-year-old Marcus Graves, reported missing from Newport Beach the very next day. From when Shelton had been abducted, and these abductions and killings of both Graves and Shelton had homicide detectives concerned that there was a new freeway killer on the loose. They had arrested Patrick Carney, also known as the trash bag killer, in 1977, and now their suspicions were beginning to either realize that there was a new killer on the loose, or their fears were becoming reality, that there indeed was multiple serial killers working in the area. A few weeks later, another body was discovered, as 15-year-old Donald Hayden was discovered, the very same day he had disappeared from Hollywood. The next week, 17-year-old David Murillo had been reported missing, and a week after that, his dead and tortured body was found. 20 days later, off of Interstate 10, an unidentified body was found, and between September and December, 3 more unidentified bodies were found. And in between, 18-year-old Frank Fox was found murdered in Long Beach. 15 murdered boys, aging from 15 to 18, found along the roadsides in California, all in less than a year. Detectives now had something more sinister on their hands than they realized. In fact, they were coming to realize that they were probably dealing with the devil himself. And it was becoming clear that the way he killed was much more different than the other killings. They were coming to realize that they were dealing with the real Freeway Killer. More to come right after this. Dan here. I just wanted to take a moment and thank you for following along. If you're like us here at Murder Wall, you like true crime. We dive into the stories here and want to invite you to check in every Monday to what we're calling Murder Monday, and follow along weekly wherever you listen to your podcasts, whether Spotify, Apple, or YouTube, and a whole host of others. We like hearing from all of you, so consider dropping us a comment, even a suggestion of an episode you would like to hear, and we'll keep episodes coming. Thanks again, and for now, let's get back to the story. 1979 couldn't have ended any worse for detectives in the California area where the freeway murders were occurring. But it wasn't just that. Homicides as a whole seemed to be on the rise coast to coast, so much so that historically speaking, the 70s was given the name the golden age of the serial killer. From a true crime perspective, they thought they had ended the freeway killings with the capture of Patrick Carney, but their hunch of the possibility of more than one killer started to become a reality, especially with the recent murders taking place around the Long Beach area. 1980 didn't start any easier for them. January 3rd, a body was discovered in San Bernardino County. Records would show that it was the remains of 16-year-old abductee Michael McDonald from Canada, who went missing on New Year's Day. 1 month later, another body showed up in Hollywood and was determined to be the body of missing 14-year-old Charles Miranda. 2 days later, another body was discovered, this time 12-year-old James McCabe from Huntington Beach. Later in March, 18-year-old Ronald Gatlin found murdered, and 1 week after the discovery of Gatlin's body, yet another victim was reported missing from Huntington Beach. 15-year-old Russell Pugh, missing on March 21st and found dead the following day at the Lower San Juan camping ground. This time, 2 bodies were found, with 14-year-old Glenn Barker found along with Pugh, and March 25th, 15-year-old Harry Turner was found dead. The killings kept mounting up, and the investigation began heating up body after body. And these were all teenagers of the ages of 12 and 14 and 15 years of age. And April 10th, the Freeway Killer struck again. This time claiming 2 victims, 16-year-old Stephen Wood and kidnapping and killing 18-year-old Lawrence Sharp 2 hours later in Long Beach. April 29th, 19-year-old Darren Kendrick went missing from Stanton, California, and his body discovered a few weeks later in Carson, California. The investigators were sure of a few facts. The killer was certainly mobile, kidnapping his victims, killing them, and dropping their bodies off at other locations. Also, there were traces of chloral hydrate found in Darren Kendrick, which was a popular knockout agent in the form of drops, and the killer had an appetite for boys, young boys, teenagers, and the killings seemed to increase. May 19th, 14-year-old Sean King went missing without any trace, and a few weeks after that, on June 2nd, 18-year-old Stephen Wells went missing and found dead the following day at Huntington Beach. The police needed a break, anything to point them to the murderer, a witness to come forward, evidence leading to some arrests to put the murders to a stop. And finally, on June 10th, 1980, they got the break they were desperately needing. Back in May, a young 18-year-old named William Pugh was arrested for auto theft. While sitting in jail, he heard the news on the radio about the Freeway Killer murders and began to open up to a counselor about Bonin, and openly confessing to inside knowledge of the murders, and identified the killer as 32-year-old Bonin, a Vietnam vet truck driver from Downey, California. Immediately, investigators began their look into Bonin's background and found a couple red flags, including a conviction in 1969 on felony counts of kidnapping and sodomy, child molestation, and forced oral. The charges came from separate attacks and ended by Bonin being diagnosed as a mental sex offender and committed to a state mental hospital. 5 years later, a psychiatrist recommended that Bonin be released and found him no longer dangerous, according to the record. 2 years later, he was back in prison, convicted of kidnapping and raping a 14-year-old, and was paroled in 1978. The police were confident they had their murderer, but they needed more evidence tying Bonin to the murders. They needed to catch him red-handed. More on the Freeway Killer right after this. Hi there, Daniel Hart here. We consider ourselves here at Murder Wall as a community, meaning you, the listener. We love hearing from each one of you, and you can certainly reach us by email at murderwallpodcast@gmail.com. That's murderwallpodcast@gmail.com. Maybe you have a question that you'd like us to answer or a story that you'd like to dive into with us. Whatever it is, feel free to contact us via email or simply drop us a line or comment wherever you listen to your podcasts. Giving us a positive review always helps us, but regardless, we want everyone to feel like it's more than just Dan telling a story. We want you, the listener, to be part of it as well. Thanks again for listening, and for now, let's get back to the story. The police were confident that they had their guy, but they needed to have concrete evidence tying Bonin to the murders. They needed to catch him in the act. And so detectives placed his van under surveillance, waiting for their moment to catch a cold-blooded murder red-handed. "24 hours later, on June 11th, officers followed Bonin's van to Hollywood, where he picked up a 15-year-old boy named Harold and caught Bonin in the act of raping the teen, arresting him and booking him back at the station on various sex charges and suspicion of murder. While Bonin remained in jail, a month later, a 22-year-old named Vernon Butts was arrested and charged with being an accomplice with Bonin on 6 of the Freeway murders. But with those charges, Butts broke down and began to name more involved with the murders, and arrests were made on 19-year-old James Michael Monroe, 19-year-old Gregory Miley, and 20-year-old Eric Winchnitz. In California, murder committed under special circumstances, meaning they were committed under rape, torture, or robbery, may receive the death penalty. And with that, Bonin's partners began to unravel, giving testimony and stories condemning Bonin and giving details of the torture and the enjoyment Bonin had during the acts. One even remarked that Bill said he loved those sounds of screams. By January, Vernon Butts hung himself in his cell. And later that fall, at the official trial of the Freeway Killer, both Gregory Miley and James Monroe testified against Bonin, sharing how he wanted to create confusion and chaos and tried to convince them after his arrest to go around grabbing people off the street and kill them, as a way to confuse the police that the Freeway Killer was still at large. Bonin was later interviewed where he admitted to being involved in 21 murders and that he just couldn't stop killing, and how it just got easier and easier with each one that he did. By January 5th, 1982, after 8 hours, the jurors convicted Bonin of 10 counts of murder and 2 weeks later handed him the death penalty. The Los Angeles Times had an article later written in 1990 about the San Quentin Bridge Club, where it was written that on the day Randy Kraft arrived at the prison, Bonin anticipated Kraft's arrival, like a student waiting his master. Kraft and Bonin would join each other daily to play bridge. They both killed young men, but they loathed each other, so much so that they wouldn't even play as partners together during their bridge playing time. On February 23rd, 1996, the San Quentin Bridge Club was reduced to 3, leaving partners Randy Kraft, Lawrence Bittaker, and Douglas Clark one hand short, when Bonin was finally executed by the gas chamber. We started telling the story of the San Quentin Bridge Club and are wrapping up the second story of the foursome card club of serial killers William Bonin, who was the Freeway Killer. Next week, we'll take a deeper dive into card member number 3 in the club, Lawrence Pliers Bittaker, one half of what was known as the Toolbox Killers. This production was written, produced, and recorded by me, myself, and I, Daniel Hart, your host and true crime storyteller. See you next time. This is Murder Wall.